Ni hao. That was for all of our Chinese listeners. Hello, everybody. We're going to talk about the minimum wage today. And when we talk about wages, we're really talking about prices of labor. In other words, if we graph a demand and a supply curve, on the vertical axis, we're going to put the price of labor. Instead of the price of strawberries or the price of blueberries, it's the price of labor. So it's the same kind of idea. And on the horizontal axis, we're going to talk about the quantity. And instead of quantity of products, quantity of blueberries, we're going to talk about quantity of labor. So in other words, the number of workers that is going to be hired by businesses. Just like any other demand curve, the demand for labor curve is going to be a downward sloping curve. Let's say it looks something like this. So we're going to call this D sub L. That's the demand for labor. So that means that, let's say at $12, if the wage were $12, businesses would hire, let's go down to the quantity axis, about almost 20, and if you want to make it more realistic, big country, let's say 20 million workers. And on the other hand, if the wage was much lower, if that was the equilibrium wage in the market, and we go over to the demand curve there, now the wage is much lower, businesses can afford to hire more workers. Now they're hiring a little bit more than 50 million workers. The supply curve of labor is upward sloping, just like any other supply curve for products. So this might be the supply curve of labor, the purple curve. So I'm going to call this S sub L, supply of labor. And if we look at a couple of points on the supply curve of labor, let's use $6 again. And let's graph a line to the purple curve. Then we will see that the supply of labor is about 30. In other words, if the wage was 6, which is not a very high wage in the United States at least, then only 30 million people would want to work at that wage. Now, if the wage were, let's use 12, just like for the demand curve, 12, we're going to graph a line to the purple curve. That's a relatively high wage, and we notice that at $12, and if we go down to the horizontal axis, we notice that about 70 million people would want to work at $12. The equilibrium wage in this market is, of course, at the intersection of the two curves, so it's right there. If you graph a line over to the vertical axis, it would be at an equilibrium wage of about $8. So that would be the equilibrium wage in that particular area of our country, or that particular country. And if you go down to the quantity axis, you'll see that about 45 million people would be employed at that equilibrium wage of $8. So that's the equilibrium wage. That's the free market wage. And that is the wage that businesses would pay without any government interference. So if the government didn't say anything about what the wage would have to be, then we would have an equilibrium wage of $8. A minimum wage is a wage that the government sets. And there can be a minimum wage that is above the $8, above the equilibrium price for labor, or it can be below, or it could be exactly at $8. Now let's say that the minimum wage that the government sets is higher than that $8, and that's typically the case for when we have a minimum wage that it's higher than equilibrium. Let's say it's at $10. So the government says we want businesses to pay $10, even though in the market at equilibrium the wage is $8. So what happens? Well, so let's say that is the equilibrium wage here, the black line. So when we hit the demand curve, that means that this is how many workers businesses want to hire. It looks like, if you go down to that quantity axis, it looks like around 30 million people. But if you draw that same line at $10 to the supply of labor, that is how many people want to work. Supply of labor is the number of people that want to work. Then it looks like it's about 60 million people that want to work. So 60 million people want to work at $10, but only 30 million people are going to get hired, because that's how much money businesses have to hire workers. So that means we have a surplus of workers of 30 million workers. A surplus of workers, of course, another word for that is unemployment. So we would have unemployment if the minimum wage is set above the equilibrium wage in the market. You can also see from this graph that the higher the minimum wage goes, the bigger the surplus is of workers, so the more unemployment we would have. Let's take a look at a special case of a minimum wage here, and that's where the equilibrium wage in a particular area is relatively high. So first of all, let's graph that situation. So let's say that this is the demand curve for labor, DL. And let's say that this is the supply of labor, the SL. So we notice that the equilibrium wage in this particular area, it could be, let's say, New York City, where wages in the market are relatively high, or California, or any other areas or countries where market wages, the free market wages, are fairly high. Now, what happens if in these areas the minimum wage, the wage the government sets, is, let's say, $8, maybe at this level here? Well, the businesses are already paying their workers $10. That is what the market bears. That is what businesses are paying. Otherwise, they wouldn't get enough workers. Otherwise, there would be a shortage if they paid less than that. And the government says, well, you got to pay your businesses at least you've got to pay your workers at least $8. Well, businesses are saying, well, we're paying them already 10. So in that particular case, the minimum wage actually doesn't have any effect on the unemployment it wouldn't cause any surpluses, because businesses are paying already 10, which is higher than 8, and the 8 is a minimum wage. So anytime that the minimum wage is below the free market wage, there would not be unemployment or a surplus of labor, because then the free market wage would, of course, overrule any kind of minimum wage. In this case, we would also have a situation where if we, let's say, increase the minimum wage from 8 to, let's say, 9, then there also wouldn't be any negative effects on unemployment, because if we were to raise the wage from 8 to 9, it's still below 10, there would still not be a surplus of labor. So you have to be careful then if economists do studies where the minimum wage in a particular area is increased from $8 to $9, and they're concluding that unemployment does not go down, which a lot of other studies would draw that conclusion. If the minimum wage increases, usually unemployment goes down, but that's only if the minimum wage is above the free market. But here the minimum wage is below the free market, and even the increase is below the free market. So in this particular case, there would not be any negative effects on unemployment. Now this would change, of course, as soon as the minimum wage goes above $10. So let's say the minimum wage becomes 11. Now we will see a surplus of labor, unemployment. And of course, it would get worse if the minimum wage goes even higher to $12 or $13 or $14.